afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for taking time out of your day to join ALEC for today's policy webinar on removing and reducing regulatory barriers to entrepreneurship. My name is Jake Morabito, and I serve as the director of ALEC's Communications and Technology Task Force, and I also direct ALEC's Center for Innovation and Technology, which studies how state and federal governments can solve today's policy challenges and improve livelihoods by promoting innovation and experimentation. I would also like to recognize my colleague Gretchen Baldau, Director of ALEC's Commerce, Insurance, and Economic Development Task Force, who will join me in co-moderating today's program. The CAT and CIED task forces are excited to welcome you for today's conversation. But before I introduce today's panelists, let me quickly go over the format for today's webinar. First, we're going to give each panelist the opportunity to introduce themselves, their organization, and deliver their remarks. And then we'll have time for questions to dive deeper into the details that they're going to be going over. But we'll also be taking your questions, time permitting. So please, as the program is going, please type your questions in either the Q&A box or the chat box. Or if it's easier, you can email me directly at jmorabito@alec.org. We hope you find the dialogue productive and helpful to your work back in state capitals. And without further ado, I'd like to recognize our first speaker today, Dr. Justin Callais, Research Fellow at the Archbishop Institute, to share more about his work and Archbridge's recent report on barriers to entrepreneurship. Justin, the floor is yours.
All right, great. Yeah, thank you again for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion and to hear from everyone else. So yes, my name is Justin Callais. I am an assistant professor of economics and finance at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, as well as research fellow at the Archbishop Institute, where I look at mostly the impact of mobility or the determinants of mobility and the impact of mobility on various different outcomes. So to kind of take a step back and think about what I'm going to be discussing today, we're going to be talking about the trend of business dynamism within the US, how the fact that it's fallen in recent years, why is that the case, and what does it mean for mobility? How does the US compare in what I call the environment for entrepreneurship to other countries? And what about differences within the US? And then I'll mention some suggestions for improvements, potentially both with, on a national level and within a state level. So when we think about the American dream and we think about and talk about the idea of the American dream, is it still obtainable? In what ways can we better achieve it? We're really thinking about mobility, or one of the major ways we're thinking about it is through mobility. So determining the causes of mobility is one of, at least in my opinion, the most interesting and crucial topics facing society today. The idea basically that you can improve your life and well-being, and it's not only influenced by the social class or status of your parents. So making entrepreneurship easier is good both for entrepreneurs, their employees, and their customers. Here, I mean, the regulatory environment or this environment for entrepreneurship. The easier it is to start a business, the more likely it is that someone's going to do so, and the higher expected returns. But it also impacts the entrepreneurs themselves, but also the employees and their customers. So more regulations or higher taxes can make it more expensive for people to hire in the first place, meaning that they can hire fewer workers, and those workers typically get lower wages. One example is payroll taxes, which have been found to lower the wages of employees substantially. Employees bear most of that burden of payroll tax. Finally, taxes and regulations make it more expensive to produce the good, meaning that both fewer goods are produced in the first place, and they're produced at higher prices, meaning that there's fewer people that have access to them. And also, entrepreneurship leads to economic growth, which helps those across the income distribution. We consider this to be a positive spillover effect to everybody that we have through entrepreneurship, even those who aren't just direct customers or employees of the business. And the main channel through this is through economic growth. Economic growth is a direct way in which absolute mobility occurs. Studies have found that roughly 1/3 through 1/2 of the differences in economic growth can be explained by entrepreneurship, specifically productive entrepreneurship, ones that create jobs, ones that innovate, rather than just redistributes and rent seeks. So this is from a great group, the Economic Innovation Group, that measures economic and business dynamism across states since 1992. And what they find is that since 1992, business dynamism has pretty steadily dropped, and we see a sharp decrease right around the time of the Great Recession. We see the shock to dynamism around that time, and we have not yet recovered from it. So why does it happen, and how do we get back? How do we get it back? While I'm going to talk about this broader trend, but I'm also going to talk about the differences between states. And this chart from the same group looks and scores states on their business dynamism in the most recent report of 2022. So we see high scoring states in business dynamism in purple, which those are states like Delaware, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, which is Idaho itself has had an interesting stretch of massive deregulation in recent years. That could probably explain, one of the reasons why they're scoring so highly on dynamism. We also see the lowest scoring states in dark red, like Louisiana, Hawaii, Mississippi, West Virginia, and Kentucky, states that are mostly high tax, high regulation areas. So even though dynamism itself has fallen across every state from 1992 to today, the dynamism is still different across states. So why is that? What can be done to get us back on track? What are some of the causes of falling business dynamism? So often people point to two major sort of groups or reasons as to why this is the case. They see rising market power. They see higher, market concentration, higher corporate profits, and say like, oh, this is one reason why, we're stifling others from, allowing small businesses to flourish. People also blame lower productivity and business activity, for one of the reasons why dynamism is falling. What I want to ask though is what led to market power rising and productivity falling, right? It's something to say that, okay, well, these are some of the reasons. I'm not saying that these are necessarily wrong, but we want to understand if that is the case, then why did those occur in the first place? For rising market power, for example, rules and regulations are often lobbied for by incumbent firms in order to stifle competition. So it really is the regulatory barriers that are causing market power to occur in the first place. They're stopping competitors and small businesses from potentially overtaking larger firms. When we think about lower productivity and activity, well, they say, okay, we've seen things like firm entry rates and share of young firms decline. And job reallocation has slowed down. Dispersion of firm growth has decreased. Again, this is all true, but why? Regulatory burdens are such that larger firms are able to often squelch smaller firms' ability to grow. And then that could help explain why we see this sort of gap. This speaks to job reallocation as well, since if smaller firms have a harder time becoming larger firms, then there are fewer options for workers to leave for better opportunities. So we think about from first, comparing the US to other countries, we can look at ways in which the US is already doing really well that can, explain its regulatory scores, but also its mobility scores, but also there's a lot of room for improvement. So when we first think about what does it mean to talk about income mobility, we're usually measuring intergenerational income mobility, which is the relationship between one's income and their parents' incomes. So higher scores here mean that there are going to be more income persistence. Your income is highly determined on your parents. So ideally, you would want a pretty low score in this area. You might not necessarily want there to be no relationship between, raising raising a child and their outcome in life, but you don't want, if you're born in a poor class family, you don't want that to necessarily mean that your kid's destined for that same life path. When we look at this, the United States scores roughly middle of the road out of the 74 countries that we have data on. It shows that roughly about 54% of one's own income can be explained mainly by their parents' income. This puts them right in line with rich countries like Italy and Slovakia, but also developing countries like India and Jordan. So if this is the case, if the US in terms of mobility is roughly middle of the road, it means that, at least taking this at face value, that other countries are doing something that is leading to being able to achieve the American dream, right? They're able to achieve the American dream perhaps in some margins better than the US, but in just their own countries. So why is that? I talk about regulations. We're going to talk about labor market regulations, business regulations, specifically some of the other subcomponents like starting a business, measures of impartial business administration, and private sector credit. The US scores pretty well in terms of labor market regulations compared to other countries, and business regulations also rank quite well, usually in the top 10 or so, but they've worsened over time. We've seen a decline in their score over time. So let's look at some of the more specifics, a little more granular level. The US ranks 10th in starting a business, but they score really low on impartial business administration. They scored just 29th out of those same 74 countries. This means that government regulators are treating people and businesses differently based on their status or political capital. Also, private sector credit is probably where the US has the best room for improvement. We've seen that out of those 74 countries, the US scores in the bottom 15. This suggests that there's a high reliance on public money for credit, which again can be used to dole out political favors rather than for economic reasons, as well as stringent banking regulations that can make it hard for people to access capital. So both using public credit as a way to dole out political favors, but also just having higher business regulations or higher banking regulations that make it more difficult for people to access credit in the first place. Since upcoming entrepreneurs rely on credit often in order to start a business, this is especially crucial. So we look at measures of business regulation, comparing that with its income mobility, we see an interesting trend. We see places that have more lax business regulations, which are places that score in the 8, 9, 10 rankings, have less income persistence. Similarly, this is true for impartial bureaucracy. We see that places that have really impartial bureaucracies also have less income persistence, meaning that people are being judged based on the merits of their case or their permit, rather than who do they know and what can they provide or bribe to the administrator. So there's, overall, the kind of story is the US is doing, pretty well in mobility and pretty well in regulations, but there's many ways in which we can do better. Again, we want people to achieve the American dream. It's going to be through some mechanisms, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But now if we look at within the US, kind of what do we see? So we use measure of relative and absolute mobility at the MSA level. This is measurements from a really great, really well-known economist, Raj Chetty at Harvard. And they find that areas that are particularly high scoring in mobility to be places like Logan and Provo, Utah, as well as St. Cloud, Minnesota. Low mobile areas would be places like Shreveport, Louisiana, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Memphis, Tennessee, those areas. So again, I'm trying to ask why. What can explain those differences in relative and absolute mobility? I look at first occupational licensing, which is the number of low income licenses that a state requires in order to obtain, the permission or the right to do something. Here we see that Washington State and Louisiana have the most number of low income occupational licenses, 77, while Wyoming and Vermont have the least, and they're only in the 20s or 30s. So there's vast differences among states and how they license different occupations. I also look at overall business dynamism. Again, going back to those figures that I showed earlier from the Economic Innovation Group. I also look at specific subcomponents like percentage of jobs in new companies, percentage of jobs in incumbent firms, and labor force participation rate, or how active is the labor force. More jobs in new companies means that there's a dynamic business ecosystem. People can easily move and find work, and they don't necessarily have to uproot their life in order to find opportunities. More jobs in incumbent firms is a measure of control that older and established firms have on the local economy. And the labor force participation rate tells us how active the labor market is, who's wanting to be an active participant in the labor market, and how can we get that to increase. So if we look at scores of relative mobility, which again, lower scores is greater mobility, and we find that places that are more dynamic in terms of their business environment score lower on their relative mobility, which means that they're more mobile. Their people have greater relative opportunities. On the flip side, if we see places that look at the percentage of places that have jobs in incumbent firms, meaning that firms that have been around for a decade or a little over a decade, we see that the more reliant you are on firms that have been there for a long time, the less mobile you're likely to be. This tells us that, if there's an over-reliance on incumbent and established firms, there might be less opportunities and less, chances for new businesses to come in and start and employ people. On the flip side, we have absolute mobility, which is higher scores, meaning better mobility. We see that a more active, a more flexible workforce leads to, or is correlated to, higher mobility. So again, we want to ask, how do we get more active and dynamic economies within the US? And that's where I'll sort of conclude. Business dynamism matters for entrepreneurship, which matters itself for growth and mobility. So we then need to figure out how to get more dynamism and more entrepreneurship, right? They're kind of two in the same, right? We get more entrepreneurship, we become a more dynamic economy, both at a state level and at a national level. So we have some possible suggestions for the US. These are suggestions from both the paper that, the report that I wrote for Archbridge, as well as other great scholars who work in the area. These are, remove occupational licenses for low-income jobs. Occupational licensing is often used to help incumbents, and we see, little to no trade-offs in terms of higher benefits, in terms of quality or safety. So it makes it harder for those to start their careers. Make it easier to access private sector credit. More public sector credit can be used for political reasons instead of economic, and lower banking regulations that make it easier to start banks in the first place and give out loans to small businesses. That provides people the opportunity to get started. Also, access to higher quality education. Productivity is growing, but at a slower pace than usual, and many people blame education in the US as one of those key reasons. So things like education freedom, school choice, right? Competition is good. We like competition in our everyday lives. We like that there's people competing to provide us the best shirts and food. Well, we should, the same should be true for education. And finally, lower taxes and fewer regulations overall. People vote with their feet. Empirical evidence shows that people and businesses are moving to places with more freedom and more opportunity. And those are typically places that have lower taxes and fewer regulations. Again, we think of states like Florida and Texas, where people are moving to, but also other states like Colorado and Utah, where these places are, getting easier in terms of starting businesses, getting easier in terms of not punishing people for working there. And really, in those areas, we're starting to see some of the, where we see the difference in dynamism sort of not have as high of an impact, right? The decline in dynamism is taking place, but to a lower extent in those areas. So again, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you, and I'm looking forward to any and all questions at the end. Justin Callais, and I have to put my email in case anyone wants to talk after. Right,
Thanks so much, Justin. That was a lot of great information. And in case anyone didn't see, we did put the link to the full publication in the chat, and I'm sure we'll dive into that more in the Q&A. But next, I'd like to recognize Alex Reinauer, who's a research fellow with the Center for Technology and Innovation at the Competitive Enterprise Insitute, to share more about CEI's work and how technology helps enable entrepreneurship across the states. Alex, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Sid, I'm Alex Reinauer, research fellow at CEI. We're a nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C. that promotes deregulation and approaches policy from a free market perspective. And I want to take some time to discuss technology's role in entrepreneurship, as well as its role in growth of small businesses. And it seems clear as we finally put COVID-19 pandemic behind us, that there are some things that are going to stay. Things like working from home are now a commonplace and allow employees to avoid living in a big city if they don't want to. Remote work has allowed employers to expand their search for potential employees, and they're far less restricted by geography and location when looking for the best talent that is going to be best for their business. Video conferencing through Zoom and other services have transformed numerous industries. Telehealth services for local doctors' offices. It's allowed for cost savings and time savings in healthcare. I know I enjoy not having to sit in a waiting room for an hour if I don't have to when getting a prescription filled. And video calls have also allowed for the growth of other businesses, online tutoring, exercise instruction, music lessons, and other types of services. And this is not to say that we shouldn't do things in person, right? In some instances, there's just no substitute for in-person interaction. But it's important that we create a regulatory environment that allows for flexibility, supplementation, and probably most importantly, freedom in deciding how one opens a business and how one operates that business. And a lot of things have changed over the last few decades. Now about 50% of US businesses are home-based. They operate within someone's residence. And when it comes to non-employer firms, entrepreneurs, companies that don't have any employees, that number goes up to 60% being home-based. So if you look at a company like Etsy, which is an online platform that allows users to sell goods and services and products, the number of arts and craft businesses have doubled since the start of the pandemic. And their overall user base still, to this day, continues to grow as more businesses and entrepreneurs utilize their platform. And the great thing of if you're a small business or an entrepreneur is that if you don't like Etsy's platform, you can go to a different platform. You can take your business to Amazon or eBay. And if you don't like those platforms, you can launch your own website within your own domain and direct traffic to that site by advertising through companies like Google or Facebook. So what we like to call the platform economy has really created endless avenues for entrepreneurs and small businesses to expand their offerings to a greater number of people. We're no longer limited by foot traffic in a local shop. You can find customers from around the country and even around the world. But while we can easily choose one platform or another or switch from one platform to another, it's far more difficult to choose or switch your local and state government to decide which regulatory regime that you want to operate your business under, especially if you're one of these small home-based businesses or entrepreneurs. And probably some, I guess, the biggest areas of reform that can help these small businesses and entrepreneurs are, I think, probably zoning, permitting, and licensing. I know Justin has done some really great work on licensing in his report. I was a little disappointed to find out that his in my home state of Louisiana was right up there at the top with Washington and California in the number of occupational licensings required for low-income jobs. That was pretty startling. And these regulations accumulate with other layers of regulations to create what some call a regulatory thicket, or what I like to call a regulatory jungle gym that put up serious barriers to entry for entrepreneurs and small businesses. And they often halt innovation before the business even opens up their doors. The Institute of Justice did a great report on this and found that among the 20 cities they studied, that a new business has to pay on average 13 fees that together amount to over $5,000, I think $5,300. And in San Francisco, right, a city I'm sure we all see as just the perfect example of government efficiency. The total cost of fees were around $22,000. It's pretty significant. And it just seems a little crazy that to open a barbershop, one has to go through 55 steps with 8 different government agencies just to open a small business. And even if a business is able to get off the ground, they still have to maneuver through the regulatory thicket or the regulatory jungle gym. And many often fail due to overregulation by something similar to a death by a thousand cuts. So the bad news is that there's a lot of work to be done to kind of prune the regulatory thicket. But the good news is that there's plenty of areas for reform. And I think generally there should be a goal of lowering the fees necessary to start a business. We should try to shorten the waiting times for permits and licensing. And we should also try to lessen the burden of paperwork, because instead of focusing time and resources on improving their product or service, small businesses and entrepreneurs are being bogged down by compliance costs. I think it's important to note, these compliance costs don't only hurt businesses. They ultimately harm consumers for which those businesses serve. So it's really a lose-lose situation, because compliance costs are typically passed on to consumers in the form of either higher prices, lower quality products and services, or both. So I think one great thing that states can do is to create a kind of regulatory review commission that evaluates the current regulatory regimes for the purpose of eliminating duplicity and modernizing regulations. And I think Ohio is a fairly good example of this. But as Justin pointed out, dynamicism in Ohio is pretty low. But the Ohio recently announced a new common sense initiative that builds upon previous efforts during the last decade to improve the state's regulatory code. And a couple of years ago, I took a really deep dive into those efforts, tracking several thousand different regulatory changes. And it's amazing that even some of the smallest changes can have really big effects. Stuff like consolidating regulations for barbers and cosmetologists under the same code section, expanding licensing to allow for mobile barbers where they bring the barbershop to you in a large vehicle, and also modernizing regulations to allow for new technologies that not only increase the bottom line for small businesses, but still allow them to improve on services for their patrons. So I applaud the really great work that others are doing on this front. I think a lot of us in DC get distracted by federal powers and federal regulation when there's really a lot of work to be done at the state and local level.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alex. That was really interesting. And to kind of wrap things up with our introductory remarks, I'd like to go ahead and recognize Ron Hart and Shane Somm from PrizePicks to discuss past, present, and future innovation in the ever-changing world fantasy sports industry, and to share about some of the regulatory burdens they might have faced as a relatively new company in a growing industry. So Ron and Shane, I'll turn it over to you. I think we're going to put up your slides right now.
Perfect. Thank you, Jake, and thank you, Gretchen, Alex, and Justin. It's been really interesting. Definitely learned a lot there. Appreciate everyone taking the time here. My name is Ron Hart. I'm a senior government affairs manager with PrizePicks. Been with the company coming up on 3 years now, and really enjoyed myself. And I'll kick it to my colleague Shane for a quick intro here.
Yeah, thanks, Ron, and thank you, everybody. I want to thank everyone involved in ALEC. I'm the Shane Somm, Director of Regulatory Government Affairs at PrizePicks. I joined the company last year. They pulled me from, I spent more than the last decade working in the Texas legislature. I worked for Governor Abbott on his economic development team, and the easiest job in the country in convincing businesses to move to Texas. And now I've switched over to what I think is one of the more fun jobs of talking about fantasy sports and having legislators in other states make fun of me for being a Dallas Cowboys fan. So kick it back to you, Ron.
Thank you, Shane. And I poke plenty of fun on the Cowboys note for sure, but I'm a Falcons guy, so who gets the last laugh here? Gretchen, if you could just go to the next slide. I wanted to briefly mention this is actually our second year as ALEC members, coming in at a little bit of a bigger contribution at this point, and we're really excited. And I've seen all the great stuff that ALEC has done in the past, so excited to be a part of it. I wanted to briefly touch on some brief background on PrizePicks before we dive in. So PrizePicks is the largest independently owned fantasy sports operator in North America. We're headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, where I am now. We have around 300 plus US based employees with a very realistic goal to be at 500 by the end of the year 2023. Now, when I joined in Q4 2020, I was the 19th employee. So we've seen some serious growth in the past few years and plan to keep that going. On our platform, we have 3 million users, but we call them members to kind of elevate their experience. So 3 million members on the PrizePicks platform and growing. We hope to see that number by 4 million by Q1 24 by the end of the year here. Our awards trophy case is definitely growing, but most recently we were awarded the fastest growing sports gaming company in North America by the Inc. 5000, and additionally awarded the Fantasy Sports Operator of the Year by EGR, which is the Electronic Gaming Review. And our partnerships, we've boasted past, present, and hopefully we'll have some additional future ones coming up here to add to this graphic, with leagues such as NASCAR, teams in our hometown, such as the Atlanta Braves, Atlanta Falcons, and Atlanta United, and the Miami Marlins and Jacksonville Jaguars, with plenty more to come. And I'll kick it to Shane for the next slide here.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, so this is just a coverage map showing you PrizePicks is available in over 31 states. As Ron maybe mentioned, we call ourselves the fantasy operator of the Southeast, but as you can see, we are available throughout the country. What you get from this map really is that while we operate in 31 states, we have about 7 states and we're targeting more than 10 with actual fantasy sports operator licenses. We actually do prefer to have a fantasy sports license as opposed to just being able to operate in the state. Some of the states that we are in now are Alabama, Arkansas, and we are soon to have a license in Tennessee. We just got approved in Indiana for an actual license, hoping to go live there by July 4th. We really, ourselves and other companies just like us in our industry, thrive in states that have that lower regulatory threshold, but at least have something on the books. I think like a lot of industries, having a good regulatory body that has a good control of the industry is ideal for all of us, and any states that support more of a free market style is obviously what we're looking for. And I'll kick back to Ron to how you actually play our.
And you can jump to the next slide there, Gretchen. On that last slide, I would love to see a lot more yellow there, and that's obviously our target goal for these this next 12 to 18 months here. So how do you actually play the PrizePicks game? There's obviously, we've derived from the fantasy football season-long traditional, you're drafting a team with your 10 to 12 college buddies. You're playing a different matchup each week. You're doing a little trash talking here and there. And really where we derive from is a lot of people were, losing their first 6 to 7 weeks, and then ultimately you have nothing to play for. So that kind of turned into what's called daily fantasy sports. In traditional daily fantasy sports, you would be drafting a lineup and entering a contest against 10 people or 100,000 people or 500,000 people with a prize pool. And there's some of our industry peers have prize pools up to $15 million in prizes. With a grand prize being $1 million, and there's 300,000 plus people playing in it. But what we noticed very early on were customers and fantasy sports enthusiasts, of which there are over 50 million still playing in America today, were getting real frustrated when they would enter a daily contest and they would end up in 50,000. And they wouldn't win much money, even though they only entered for $1 to $5. So with PrizePicks, what we did is made it a lot more simple, and kind of gives you the best chance to show your knowledge and skill, and puts you just against the numbers and not up against hundreds of thousands of people. So just as you would draft, your season-long fantasy football roster with PrizePicks, you would enter the app in an easy 4-step process. Research your players. We offer over 20 plus leagues in sports, everything from NBA, MLB, and NFL to NASCAR, tennis, and PGA. So step 1, you would be doing a little bit of research on your player performance before drafting your lineup. Now we offer kind of last 5 games in the statistics. For this instance, we're looking at strikeouts. So you would pull up a pitcher's strikeouts in their last 5 games, kind of see what our projection and how that kind of lines up with each other. You would then build your lineup. You could do a minimum of 2 players, maximum of 6. We're hoping to even put in an option for 7 by the end of the year. And then once you would build out your lineup, you would project more or less on our predicted statistics. So we would set the number and you would say, well, I think looks like we're looking at Dylan Cease here from the White Sox. So I think he's going to have more than our projected 5.5 strikeouts. And you pair it with one other player. You see Phil Mickelson in there. You could bet on his strokes. You would then enter your lineup into, we have a couple of different contests. Some offer insurance and you can win up to 10x your money. Ultimately, this really enhances your daily sports viewing experience. You know, we have customers who are, you know, just throwing in $5 to $10 just to spice up an NFL Sunday after they've lost 6 straight fantasy football matchups. So I'll kick it to Shane for a little background on our legal precedent.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, so as you can see, what Ron just presented to you is what the daily fantasy sports industry looks like today. You know, that's an example of our app, but there are, and I think as Ron will tell you, you know, 15, 20 other companies pretty similar to ours or different variations, but you can see there's been a lot of innovation in that industry, just like a lot of industries. You see innovation, and what we're looking for, and Ron will talk about in a little bit, is some model language to help ensure that this industry can continue to grow. But I think it's useful to look back to how did we get here? And so if you look back to 2006, the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act and exemption for fantasy sports, there's a lot that went on with this act, but important for our industry is it just defined in federal law that fantasy sports is not a bet or a wager. And a lot of times when we go to state legislatures, we spend a lot of time educating on the difference between sports betting and fantasy sports. And while people maybe see similarities, as we see in a lot of policy areas, the law does a good job of delineating one between the other. And one of those key differences is that fantasy sports is considered predominantly a game of skill rather than predominantly a game of chance. And again, those definitions are put in federal law and throughout various state laws. And I think that's an important indicator of the difference between them. There's also been a few important state court cases that have clarified that. So we listed an example here, April 2015, the Kansas AG Derek Schmidt, he issued an opinion that confirmed games of skill. As you'll see, I'll skip a little bit down. In 2020, Illinois Supreme Court, same thing. The ruling was a big win for daily fantasy sports that DFS, which is short for daily fantasy sports, is a game of skill. And I'll go back to kind of 2018. This is important to just show you where the industry has kind of changed and who the players were. So the Supreme Court found PAPSA unconstitutional. It clears the path for states looking to successfully legalize sports gambling. Again, fantasy sports is not sports gambling, but this was significant because the major players in sports and fantasy sports at that time, very large company names that I'm sure you're all aware of now, at this time, they changed their business models. They essentially left innovating in the fantasy sports world and started focusing entirely on legalizing sports betting across the country. I think for all of you in your state legislatures, they've probably been there, and we've seen a number of states legalize sports betting in the last few years. Those companies leading it are the ones that kind of left the fantasy sports world, and that's where a company like ours, PrizePicks, came into the industry and really started innovating. And I think what's important about that is that it's really consumer driven. I believe it's the consumer experience. I compare it to when Uber and Lyft started coming around, and it really changed how taxis and the taxi industry operated. And there were many regulators who didn't understand how to incorporate Uber and Lyft because they were trying to force them to look like taxi companies or act like taxi companies when they may be similar. They were not taxi companies. And I live in Austin, Texas. They tried to outlaw them here. That didn't last very long. And I mentioned that just to state that just like that, PrizePicks came in, some of our other colleagues and other companies like us came in and have continued to innovate based off of how these consumers want to play daily fantasy sports. And I think as you saw in how Ron was explaining the game and showed you the game in the previous slide, there's been a number of differences. When I was playing fantasy sports in the 90s, it was just you went on like a Yahoo and you played a season-long thing. And I got my butt kicked for 14 weeks, and all I could talk about was, oh, I'll get you next season. Well, eventually, luckily, consumers asked for something else to play. They wanted to go out and play maybe a daily game or have a new lineup each week or a new lineup every couple of weeks. And so PrizePicks came along and provided that opportunity. And so I'll kick it to Ron to talk about the model policy that we're looking to enact. It kind of shows where the industry has changed to and how we need to update some of these definitions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Shane. And apologies on that 14 straight weeks of butt kicking. We were shared that pain for sure. So just to add on to what Shane said there's definitely, as we're seeing, there's a huge appetite for sports betting. But, what PrizePicks prides itself on is treating the 50 million and growing plus consumers that are avid fantasy sports players. So there's definitely that appetite, and we don't want those consumers left behind. lacking in innovation. So we kind of took it upon ourselves to change that narrative. So, what are we doing in ALEC? In 2016, our friends over at Yahoo Fantasy Sports, who I'm sure everyone is familiar with, pushed some fantasy sports model policy through ALEC. And while we are big supporters of what they did, and we're definitely friendly with the folks over at Yahoo, you can imagine how different the fantasy sports industry was in 2016 versus what it is now 7 years later in 2023. Just the key difference for me is there were probably around 2, 3, 4 operators, fantasy sports operators in 2016. We're now looking at around 15 to 20 in our space and growing every day, offering 25, 30 different types of contests to those 50 million consumers. So while we obviously support this policy, industry has changed, and we have a couple small tweaks to the definition that ultimately are far more inclusive for those 15 to 20 different operators. And these 2 small amendments really just fully encapsulate all types of fantasy sports contests. They continue to encourage the free market that we're seeing today in the fantasy sports world. And most importantly, they encourage innovation in our space, which I'm sure will continue. And this really encapsulates the past, present, and future of fantasy sports. And there's one final slide here that Shane will touch on.
Yeah, so just kind of to wrap it up, what our ask is of this language. We see a lot of this to come out of our trips to different states and different laws that we've been working on. There's definitely a concerted effort out there as sports betting has continued to grow by some of the industry leaders to basically open the door for sports betting. And while they do that, turn around and close the door behind them for fantasy sports. They are promoting language that you see in the older language, which is in the ALEC model, that basically would shut out the entirety of our industry and only allow 2 operators to operate in fantasy sports on a daily basis. In Texas, very conservative state here, we call those vendor bills. They're not well liked, and we promote free market, inclusive language that would allow anybody in our industry, even those companies that are trying to close out others, it would also be inclusive of them. So this new language promotes that free market mentality, allows for continued innovation within fantasy sports specifically, as the consumers want, and we're constantly gauging what our members want to see, and we're seeing our competitors within our own space doing just that, and this language would help them continue to do that, and that would help keep this industry alive for years to come. So we appreciate your time, and Ron and I and a couple of our team members, we will be in Orlando in July, and so hope to see some of y'all in person. We are going to have the opportunity to do a workshop, and we'll go much deeper on some of these things. I know I went quickly on some of that history, and anybody who wants more information on some of these Supreme Court decisions across the country, or a little more discussion about this tweak to the language, Ron and I will be happy to answer those. And you see on this slide, here are our emails if you want to reach out and ask us any questions. And for those that are on the phone, mine is shane.saum@prizepicks.com. That's shane.saum. And then you can contact Ron at ron.hart@prizepicks.com, ron.heart. And that's it for me. I'll let Ron finish it out.
Yeah, no, echo all those statements, guys. We're really excited to be in Orlando in July and put some faces to the name, and teach you guys a little bit more about fantasy sports, maybe get you on the app and playing a little bit. It's a lot of fun. And any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ron and Shane. And I think it's really fascinating to hear about how your industry has evolved over time. And I think that echoed a sentiment that Alex raised about kind of the need to modernize, as far as our regulatory framework to support innovation. So before we turn it over to Q&A, Gretchen, please interrupt me if you see any questions coming through. But just as a reminder, type your questions into the Q&A box of the chat bot, or you can send them by email to me at jmorabito@alec.org. But if we don't have any yet, while you still are thinking of your questions, I have a question for Alex, if you don't mind. So you had mentioned about, I feel like I'd be remiss as a tech policy person to not bang the AI drum. So if anybody had that on their bingo cards, now's your opportunity to scratch that off. But so how do you see, as we see a lot of these emerging technologies, you mentioned telehealth, and there's some great innovations that have come through. Some states are looking to regulate artificial intelligence or internet platforms, app marketplaces. So as what have you seen that some of these regulations how might that affect the small business community and entrepreneurs looking to get started?
Well, I think there's a general concern about over-regulating AI before it's even outside the markets. I mean, this is a nascent technology. It's not fully developed yet. If you remember watching the social network, about the creation of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg is very early corrects. Like, we don't know what it is yet. We don't know what it is. And that's very much the case with AI. I think AI is going to be very beneficial to small businesses in the way it's going to create efficiencies and allow them to work quicker. I know there's some concern about labor displacement and that it can possibly lead to a loss of jobs. I'm kind of a traditional on Friedrich Hayek on this. I think actually, while there may be some displacement of the jobs in the short term, in the long term, the increased efficiency will ultimately lead to more jobs. And I think from a kind of legislative standpoint, the real fear is that we have kind of 50 different regulatory regimes for AI in all the states. So it kind of leads you, I mean, I like as little regulation and legislation as possible, but there does show some need, similar to how we deal with kind of the state privacy laws. There may be a need for some kind of federal framework to ensure that these companies can operate in all 50 states consistently, and consumers aren't, harmed in any adverse way.
Awesome.
A question did come through asking for the current ALEC model policy on fantasy sports. So I put that in the chat. The amendments that were submitted will also be available on the ALEC website next week on Tuesday. So if anybody wants to take a closer look at those will be available on Tuesday on the ALEC website. Question for you, Justin. So in that map you showed, you had a gradient of states and colors and everything like that. What were were there specific factors that went in determining the colors of the state? How, what's the word you use? How dynamic the states are and how, or maybe not dynamic the states are. And then in those certain factors, is it like if a state passes 2 bills and passes 2 reforms, it's suddenly going to change color from like a dark purple to the lighter color or something like that?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked this question, because I think that, kind of looking back on it, I think that was something I should have been a little more clear about. So what goes into the actual business dynamism scores is more of the outcomes of entrepreneurship and an entrepreneurial ecosystem. While at least the stuff that I've focused on in my own research is typically the regulations that would then expect to influence the outcomes themselves. So for example, for business dynamism, some of the measures that went into it are like migration rates, so like people coming in, moving in, and that leads to typically more jobs, more people are moving because of opportunities and things like that. Labor force participation rates, just patents in terms of as a measure of innovation, firm startups. So it's definitely more on the outcome side of how measuring the actual level of entrepreneurial activity in their ecosystem. Even something like housing permits, I believe, is in there in terms of if we're building more housing, we're allowing, at least if people haven't moved here yet, it's at least providing a way for people to come move here, right? If make it a little more affordable for people to come and move there if they want to. But yeah, so if they, for example, if the state reformed its sports betting policies in direction that PrizePicks put up in their presentation, you wouldn't expect to see that impact the business dynamism score right away, because it's not a measure of regulation. But it is you expect it to eventually kind of have an influence on it at some point later.
Okay, so it's more maybe like taking the temperature of something. You change the thermostat, but you have to wait for the internal temperature to change a little.
Right,
It does have
exactly. Yeah, so
okay.
Yeah, so regulations obviously going to regulation taxes are obviously going to impact them eventually. It's just what dynamism measures specifically, at least the way Economic Innovation Group does it, is more of the outcomes themselves rather than the entrepreneurial environment or the regulatory environment that can breed more entrepreneurship.
Okay. And then a question for you, Alex. So you mentioned zoning as one of the either ways that, let's see, one of the ways that businesses can be impacted greatly. As I think you're especially referencing the home-based businesses. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, certainly. And I should note that I'm not a zoning expert, but I have dealt with this a little bit, kind of in its intersection with these topics. A lot of these zoning laws were created in a time where there was this really kind of focus on the delineation between residential neighborhoods, business neighborhoods, and business was always associated with foot traffic and people coming in and out, parking. But that's just not the case anymore. We were a far different economy, far more technologically inclined. That's not going to allow those kind of foot traffic issues. So there's really a need to kind of reform, revamp zoning to ensure that someone operating, a very small business as a hair salon, maybe servicing 2 or 3 people a day, is not prevented from doing this in an economically efficient way in their own home, while still operating a business and still providing a useful service, and at the same time not bring in that kind of excess disruptive foot traffic or parking.
Okay. Do you work on home-based businesses at all that do food service? Because I think that's been a question I've seen a lot. It's like, well, maybe I'm okay making keychains in their living room or something and selling them, but I don't really want somebody running a pseudo restaurant or a pseudo like Uber Eats place out of the house next to me.
Yeah, certainly, especially in the pandemic, it was an absolutely huge topic. It has kind of tapered down a little bit, but there may be some responsibility on the platforms to say, look, this is a home-based business. At least give some information to consumers to do so. But me as an individual, if I really enjoy, I don't know, the tacos or pancakes made by a nice old lady down the street who wants to put it on Uber Eats or their choice or Grubhub, that I should be able to engage in commerce in that. And if there are any bad instances of bad services, we have a terrific online atmosphere where there are reviews and information to gather on whether or not you want to return or even engage in that in the first place. So it's something I have touched on a little bit. It has gone down a little bit in the pandemic, but I don't think that's a concern that amounts to something that's going to require some kind of regulatory intervention.
Okay. And then for PrizePicks, just to be clear, so if a state isn't ready to embrace sports gambling by allowing daily fantasy sports in to their state, that doesn't necessarily mean that sports betting is legalized in their state. Is that right?
That's correct.
And it has to do that distinction, like what's it, contests of skill and contests of luck.
Of chance. Yeah. So,
Of chance. Okay.
Like the 2006 federal law made it so that, we could offer pretty much cross country unless you specifically have some sort of statutory language to prevent that. Similar to, but not similar, actually, sorry, the exact opposite of what sports betting is. Sports betting has to specifically go to every single state and get legislation passed to allow them. A number of them have to do it through a constitutional amendment. So as our game is a game of skill, we don't have that same requirement. And obviously one of the big differences I don't think we touched on is we specifically fantasy sports, there's definitions as to what qualifies as it. You have to have a lineup of individual athletes, 2 to 6. You can't go into a PrizePicks app and say, I want to bet on, you can't bet on the app to begin with, but you can't say I want to bet on the Bears to beat somebody. You can't bet on teams. We don't have spreads. It's all individual player based, and you have to create your own lineups and demonstrate your skill that way.
Yeah, so essentially the ruling is the way I put it is 2 players from 2 different teams, and all has to be based on statistical accumulation. So statistical accumulation can stretch pretty far from, how quickly are NASCAR drivers racing laps to how many, passing yards is Patrick Mahomes going to throw for. So yes, Gretchen, to answer your question, but we are pursuing actively, legislation and clarification. We'd like to be clearly defined and regulated, and pay our taxes. So we're pursuing it. It's currently, there's legislation in a handful of states. We just actually, with the North Carolina sports betting bill that was just passed, there's an updated fantasy sports definition that we pushed and got our model language on there. So we would like to be clearly defined and, be out in the open and say we're legally operating here.
Correct. Jake, yeah, have you received any questions via email?
Yeah, I think this is a good question that I think will sum things up nicely as we're coming up on time. So I'll pitch this to all of you. But so we have a lot of state legislators on the call. So what would you say would be a good practical first step for some lawmakers that they can support in their states to kind of reduce the regulatory burden? So how about we'll start backwards. We'll start with Shane and Ron, go to Alex, and then Justin.
Yeah, I think first step is a lot of it is research and education. Obviously, having been a legislative staffer myself for 10 years, a chief of staff, a senior advisor in the Senate, I'd say see what regulations are on the book, talk to your regulators. A lot of times the regulators themselves know which things are overburdensome and which ones they think are outdated, but they feel like their hands are tied by current existing statute that's out there. So I always try to have a good relationship with them. I know here in Texas, a lot of states, usually your head executive director of that regulatory body is probably appointed by your governor. And so even the governor's office might have good insight into which departments are having some sort of regulatory issues.
Yeah, I think at least engaging and starting the steps to form some kind of review commission. I mean, it's just the most central, pivotal way to approach it from, I guess, an overarching way. I mean, we can all get stuck in the weeds individually looking at a particular regulation and how that either works or doesn't work. But really looking at it from a holistic standpoint to see the entire regulatory regime, the entire administrative code, and say, is there any duplicity here? Can we consolidate these codes? Can we make it easier to understand? Can we make a one-stop shop with really essential guidance to kind of help small businesses understand this? Are all kind of avenues that fit under a nice umbrella with some kind of review commission.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think kind of jumping off of that point, I agree that some sort of review commission would be very helpful, especially in terms of modernizing, kind of like Ron and Shane mentioned, that what constituted fantasy sports a few years ago is not, the regulation hasn't caught up yet with the reality of what's actually, what is being done now by different businesses. And I think in a way you want to modernize so that people can innovate and they're not kind of stuck waiting for, they have this great innovation, but because we haven't figured out how to regulate it yet, you can't do it yet. And it's like, well, that seems kind of backwards. It's like we should be able to do what we see as fit. And then if, we find some reasonable reason to stop it, then come in and regulate it, but not be able to do something in the first place just because the codes haven't been modernized. So I think modernization is probably one of the most important. And, just having an open dialogue with, even industry leaders, experts on the topic themselves. I mean, there's plenty of great organizations in Washington, D.C. and at different policy think tanks across each state that give a lot of great feedback and have a lot of great ideas as to, the specific ways to actually do it.
Awesome. Well, that takes us to time. I think it's a great way to wrap things up. So I just want to thank everyone once again for participating in this ALEC policy webinar. If you aren't already subscribed to our weekly newsletter, please visit alec.org to sign up and receive alerts on future webinars like this, other events and conferences throughout the states, as well as the latest policy news affecting their state. So I hope you have a great day and see you again for the next one.